Thank you very much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here. I will, you know the Monty Python line, now for something completely different. And I will try to do something, I will just try to pursue one simple line, which links Kafka and Freud, which is the line of waking up. What does it involve to wake up? In the beginning there is an awakening, and many of Kafka's novels and stories begin with the moment of waking up. So one awakes, but what does one awake to? One is dragged out of slumber and dreams, suddenly fully awake to confront reality. But what reality? The trial, I'll just read the first pages of some of Kafka's stories, novels. The trial famously begins with an awakening. Joseph K. wakes up in his room with two strangers popping up at his bedside in the midst of his homely intimacy. The two intruders will then proceed to eat his breakfast, they will seize his undergarments and present him the indictment. From this awakening on, his life will turn into a nightmare. He has awoken charged, with no chance of exculpation. In the first scene, on the edge of waking up at home, the home is dehomed, the Freudian concept of unheimlich, of the uncanny, is literally staged. Awakening is a threshold between sleep and wakefulness, like coming back from a foreign country. But there is a risk lurking at this threshold, for does one ever simply come back home from some distant unerring place? Can one return home when one wakes up? There is a crack in between, and the uncanny moment is precisely the moment of not being quite able to find the homely again, just for a moment. And in a passage which he eventually crossed out from the manuscript, and which is usually added in the appendix, Kafka put it brilliantly, and this is one of my favorite passages in Kafka. I quote, "The strange thing is that when one wakes up in the morning, one generally finds things in the same places where they were the previous evening. And yet in sleep and in dreams, one finds oneself, at least apparently, in a state fundamentally different from wakefulness. And upon opening one's eyes, an infinite presence of mind is required, or rather quickness of wit, in order to catch everything, so to speak, in the same place one left it the evening before." So see what I mean? You need an infinite presence of mind just to catch the things as they are. So there is a thin line. On the one hand, there is the dislocation of dreams. One has traveled far away in one's dreams, visited distant fantasy worlds. On the other hand, there is the familiar, but the familiar is elusively escaping once one comes back from this journey. There is the impossibility of placing it. One needs vigilance to catch it, to prevent it from sliding away, for its strangeness strangely coincides with everything being seemingly in the same place. It is like the homely world has been dislocated by the dream and has to be relocated when one wakes up. That is, it has to be moved in order to remain in the same place. If awakening is a threshold, then it's a threshold where for a moment relation between subject and the world wavers. And I continue this quote, "Waking up is the riskiest moment, the riskanteste Augenblick. If you manage to get through it without being dragged out of place, you can relax for the rest of the day." So, how can one survive the awakening? How can one circumvent this highest risk? What is the story of Joseph K? He is a man who has faltered on this brink, and he would never be able to relax again. Not this day, nor any of the following, not till the last day on the last page. He will be like stuck in between, no longer asleep, but not yet quite awake, and the whole novel will unfold on this edge. His protracted wakefulness, with which he will struggle throughout the novel, to the point of utmost exhaustion, appears to coincide with a protracted dream. But this is not a good way of putting it. It coincides not with the dream, but rather with something that emerged at the edge of awakening, and which is no longer a dream, but is not yet the constituted reality, in which one can find one's bearings. There's a tiny lag in between, emerging for a moment on the edge, and Kafka's guideline could be stated in these terms: don't give up on the edge, which is neither the dream nor reality, but the impossible in between. Well, there's kind of dreamlike real, which infringes upon the familiar. It all seems like a slip, like a tiny lack of vigilance. And this is what K says to his landlady, Mrs. Grubach: I was caught unawares. That's all. If immediately upon awakening, without letting myself be thrown off by the fact that the maid hasn't appeared, I'd risen immediately and, ignoring anyone in my path, had come to you and eaten breakfast in the kitchen, if I'd had you bring my clothes from my room, in short, if I had behaved reasonably, nothing else would have happened. Everything that wanted to come into being would have been stifled. So he was caught off guard. There was a reckless moment. He should have reasonably ignored the crack into which the two girls have slipped. And this is the crucial formulation: something wanted to come into being. Alles, was werden wollte. And it could have been stifled if he reacted in good time, if he could seize the possession of senses on time, but he didn't. There was like a momentary deficiency which enabled the impossible edge to invade everything else. We are so poorly prepared, says Joseph K. in an echo to Hamlet. At the bank, for example, I'm prepared. Nothing like this could ever happen to me there. So, when he's awake, when he's occupied his post, when he exerts power from his social position, he is well equipped and could fend off any such intrusion. So the tiny lack of vigilance on Joseph K.'s part is the tiny opening of Kafka's relentless vigilance, on which he will not give way, persevering on the edge to the terrible end. Awakening is the riskiest moment, says Kafka, and if one lets one's vigilance slip, even stranger things can happen, like one can wake up as an insect. Gregor Samsa in Metamorphosis missed for a moment the quickness of wit to catch everything in the same place. He didn't find his own body. He mislaid it for a moment. Awakening is metamorphosis. There is a metamorphosis lurking in every awakening. On the first page of the castle, the Landsverwer K arrives at the village at the foot of the castle in the late evening. He calls it the inn to spend the night, and since there is no room, they put him on a bank. This all happens in the first paragraph. And I quote, some peasants were still sipping beer. He didn't want to talk to anyone. He fetched himself a straw mattress from the attic and lay down close to the stove. It was warm. Peasants were silent. He watched them for a bit with tired eyes and then fell asleep. But soon he was woken up. A young man in tow clothes, etc., was standing next to him. So, you see, the young man then claims that I needed the permission from the castle authorities if I wanted to spend the night there. And there is immediately commotion and argument. And everything else will follow. So everything starts by an awakening after just 2 paragraphs. And K, the Landsverwer K, wakes up caught in the middle, in this middle region. And another example, this will be my last example from Kafka, in one of the most, in his most striking and bewildering stories, the burrow, the bow. We have an animal, we have a badger in the middle of this convoluted burrow, and I can just add 2 anecdotic indications connected to this story. You know that Kafka was not really Lacan's author. He never refers to Kafka, except for once. In one seminar session in 1963, he devotes a long analysis precisely to the burrow, to this one story. And as you know, Kafka was not exactly Heidegger's author. He never refers to him. But at one point, Giorgio Agamben actually told me that he met Heidegger in his young days and confronted him at the breakfast table at some point, saying, why do you never mention Kafka? How come? He became very bemused and then went into a long monologue on one single story, which is the Burrow. So you see, there was no recorder was turned on, but you see, there is something in this burrow, which is a hidden burrow of the theoretical edifice. So this animal in the burrow has built this burrow as his underground castle, protected against all possible enemies. He has carefully considered all eventualities and thoroughly pondered over possible strategies of the intruders. So he sits there in the middle of this formidable fortification, anxiously waiting in permanent vigilance. So up to now I just quoted the first pages, but there we have an awakening which appears exactly in the middle. One day, in the middle of the story, there is a moment when everything is shattered, and it all starts with waking up. I quote, "I must have slept for a long time. I was only awakened when I had reached the last light sleep, which dissolves of itself. It must have been very light, for it was an almost inaudible whistling noise, ein kaum an sich hörbares Zischen. That wakened me. The noise was a comparatively innocent one. I didn't hear it at all at first, although it must have certainly have been there. I must first feel quite at home before I could hear it. It is, so to speak, audible only to the ear of the householder." End of quote. So there's just this tiny noise, and if you read the story, you know there's a story about this tiny noise, which comes in the middle of the story, in the exact middle of the story, out of nowhere. And it appears on the thin line of awakening. Just a very slight outer disturbance, a minimal one, waking him up. But maybe it is just a continuation of sleep. Maybe it is just a noise in the head. There's no way of placing it. But this is insisting and obtrusive. It is born on that thin line, which seems to have produced it. It comes from in between wakefulness and sleep. And it resides in the passage between the outer and the inner, the carefully protected internal and the intruding external, on the threshold. It materializes the crack between the two as a barely audible sound. And the supposed emitter of this noise, this elusive, purely acoustic creature, is nothing at all, not even a voice, but a tiny whistling. This unfathomable entity will invade the poor badger's life. It will dismantle his burrow and turn his life into a nightmare. The intruder will surreptitiously infiltrate all his elaborate fortifications and undo all his meticulous planning. This tiny, unplaceable sound is just like a tiny crack of being, but enough to become overwhelming and unstoppable. The forceful beauty and the elegance of this story is that it elaborates the absolutely minimal that emerges on this threshold. Now, enough of Kafka's examples, which could be multiplied. But let us look at this edge from another angle. At the same time when Kafka was writing The Trial, which was in 1913, was published later, Marcel Proust, in another part of Europe, and completely, of course, unbeknownst of Kafka, was preparing the publication of the first novel of the grand edifice of his novels, In Search of Lost Time. And so this first novel, The Côté de Swan, Swan's Way, which appeared in 1913, famously starts on the first page exactly on the same threshold, in the intermediate state between wakefulness and sleep. And one could say there is like the birth of the modern literature from the spirit of this threshold, from the spirit of the crack between two worlds. Yet Proust, on this first page, is crossing the threshold in the opposite direction, from the state of being awake to gradually falling asleep. The narrator is sinking into a slumber, he describes himself losing consciousness, the sleep is flooding him irresistibly, yet the threshold is elusive. Sometimes sleep arrives before one can think of it. Sometimes it recedes indefinitely, and one is feverishly awake against one's will. It is not something that one can control and command, it has a temporality and causality of its own, but what he tries to hold on to is precisely a region at the boundary. It is on this edge, and the conscious controls have given way, but before the sleep proper has taken over, the moment after one has abandoned the familiar and before one has entered the dream world, it is on this edge that all these memories start flooding in, a vast tapestry of memories that one hasn't invited nor tried to recall. They're like intruders at the interstice, what Proust will call la mémoire involontaire, the involuntary memory, beyond the reach of conscious intentions, and precisely for that reasons, the harbingers of another kind of truth. So there is an intricate web of signs and associations, unavailable to awake consciousness, yet not dreams. Everything else will follow from that threshold. What emerges there will be the realm of Proust's entire huge undertaking. He will take 7 bulky volumes to spin out what comes sneaking in on the first page. So the whole immense edifice is made of this stuff, not of such stuff that dreams are made of, nor of the stuff of wakefulness, but of this edge between the two. One could make a neat symmetrical opposition, although the two things are anything but symmetrical. Kafka starts a trial in the morning with a rude awakening into reality which turns to be utterly foreign. He awakes, but not quite. Proust starts one's way in the evening, at night, with the narrator sinking into sleep, but not quite. Joseph K. is painfully overwhelmed by a strange dreamlike reality. Proust's narrator is overwhelmed by the stuff of his uncontrollable memories, which lead him ever further away, where the intimately familiar displays a logic where it appears to be utterly new and unexpected. So one could disentangle this common denominator they share, which again one can put as this injunction, to persevere on this edge, not to give up on this threshold. And one can take cue from a remark by Walter Benjamin. You know, Walter Benjamin was the one who actually translated Proust into German, 2 volumes, and in this is brilliant essay on Proust. He says this, just one sentence, and there is no telling what encounters would be in store for us if we were less inclined to give in to sleep. Proust didn't give in to sleep. So, on this edge of slumber, there is this don't give in to sleep. The injunction to yield to this lulling edge, lose the conscious control over the world of meaning, is actually its opposite. The injunction to wake up from the slumber usually presented by consciousness and habit. So one has to give in to slumber in order to arrive to this waking up, lurking within this world. And what we find there is not a nostalgic dive into the past, and its quasi-oniric reconstruction, a recuperation of lost time in the time found again. It's not that the title hero has been lost and found again. What is at stake is rather the apprenticeship of the new. And I use this is Deleuze's term. The Proust focal point is not the past but the future. Not nostalgia of a melancholy loss and its impossible recuperation, but precisely the becoming of the new. So this Deleuze, who was a great reader of both Proust and Kafka, will insist on this at great length. And as for the stuff of Proust's memories, we owe Samuel Beckett, who was another great reader of Proust, the best line ever written on him. It's very short. Proust had bad memory. I think this is the start for any analysis of Proust one can make. Okay, so I'm coming now to psychoanalysis. Jacques Lacan, in his seminar on the 4 fundamental concepts, dwells for a moment on this strange edge between sleep and wakefulness. He takes up one of Freud's dreams from Traumdeutung, the most Kafkaesque of all dreams Freud ever interpreted, a dream which reads straight as a Kafka story. And you know the dream is very well known. A father is waking at night over his dead son, laid out in the adjoining room with burning candles. He falls asleep, during this terrible wake, leaving an old man in charge. And I quote, "After a few hours' sleep, the father had a dream that his child was standing beside his bed, caught him by the arm and whispered to him reproachfully, 'Father, don't you see that I am burning?' And indeed, the burning candles have produced a fire while the old man in charge fell asleep, and the light and the smell of the burn was integrated into father's dreams, producing this terrible, uncanny dream scene, the appeal of the dead child, which made him wake up." So this is like vintage Kafka. And Freud briefly discusses this dream, and this is the important point, really, discusses this dream at the beginning of the 7th and last chapter of his book. It's sort of very strategically placed at the point where he is, as he says, abandoning the realm of the interpretation of dreams proper and engaging in an uncertain realm that one could call beyond interpretation. And he says there is nothing much to interpret in this dream. I quote from Freud, "The problems of dream interpretation have hitherto occupied the center of the picture, and now we come upon a dream which raises no problem of interpretation, and the meaning of which is obvious. It is only after we have disposed of everything that has to do with the work of interpretation that we can begin to realize the incompleteness of our psychology of dreams." So you have the edge of interpretation where you come upon what? Beyond interpretation. What is beyond interpretation? There is this dream which produces an encounter, it presents an overlapping of the empirical and the dream reality, and something emerges precisely in this overlapping, which is irreducible to the empirical reality or to the psychology of dreams, or to the interpretation of dreams. There is this moment, there is an encounter which is there. So Freud maintains throughout his book on the dreams that one crucial function of the dream is to be the guardian of sleep. Any external disturbance which might wake us up is integrated into the dream in order to keep us asleep, to enable the continuation of sleeping. The dream protects the sleeper from the intrusion of reality, and one eventually wakes up when the external disturbance becomes too intrusive for the dream to tackle. But in this dream, something else is at stake. The father is not woken up by the external disturbance, but actually by something that occurs in the dream itself, which was trying to protect him from the intrusion. So one can say that the dream itself produces a real more overpowering than any external disturbance. There can hardly be a bigger disturbance than the fire in the next room. Still, a dream integrates this, and the father wakes up not because of the fire, but because of the impossible appeal of the dead child, appearing in the dream as something that should protect the dreamer from the disturbance. So this is the paradox. The dream, in its endeavor to shield the dreamer, creates a real from which one then tries to escape, so that one takes refuge in reality in order to be protected from what the dream has produced as a device of protection. The security measure turns out to be more dangerous than the danger against which it guards. So there is something in dreams' logical wish fulfillment that tends to run amok, a nightmare more traumatic than this disturbance, so one is forced to wake up in order to escape it. And Lacan's point, to simplify these matters to the utmost, and Slavoj has commented on this famously, and this is one of the crucial lessons of psychoanalysis, we wake up in order to be able to continue to sleep, in order to escape the excess produced by the dream in its endeavor to protect our sleep. So we could say, at first we dream in order to be able to continue to sleep, protected from the intrusion of reality, and then we wake up in order to be able to continue to sleep, protected from the intrusion of the dream itself. Both the dream and the waking up protect the sleep. Yet, between the two, there is this threshold, there is the misencounter between the two, an interface where for a moment the one infringes upon the other. I quote from Lacan, "Thus the encounter forever missed has occurred between dream and awakening, between the person who is still asleep and whose dream will not know, and the person who has dreamt merely in order not to wake up." If Freud, amazed, sees in this the confirmation of his theory of desire, it is certainly a sign that the dream is not a fantasy fulfilling a wish. End of quote. There is this encounter in the gap between two fantasies, the one which sustains the dream and the one that sustains the waking life, and Lacan there uses this peculiarity of French expletive negation. What am I avant que je ne me réveille? What am I before I wake up, or before I don't wake up? This is something that gets lost in English in translation. There is a negation, but what does this negation mean? It's utterly superfluous, and at the same time utterly ambiguous. There's both before I wake up and before I don't wake up in one sentence. So, is one awake or is one not? So Joseph K. wakes up in this temporal modality. He does and does not wake up. And this is what happens to Gregor Samsa. And this is what happens to the badger waking up to hear this sound, the sound of this edge. The strange reality into which they awake is the reality from which both the dream and the awakening were supposed to protect us. The missed encounter evokes something impossible. It only emerges for a fleeting moment, in which everything vacillates. There is like an ontological opening at this edge, where the usual assumptions are shaken for just a moment, the encounter of something that cannot be accounted for in terms of either reality or psychology, neither empirical nor psychic. Now I'm coming to my conclusion. Ontological opening may sound like a big word for something that happens to be very fickle and tiny. Yet there is an experience there that may have always existed somewhere in the margins, but which is perhaps new in the sense that it has for the first time come to occupy the center stage. And my proposal would be, in the gist, this experience is tightly linked to the privileged moment of the advent of modernity, conditioning both the advent of modern literature, later Dutch, and of psychoanalysis. There was a historical turn that one could describe as the moment of awakening. But what is at stake is not an awakening to reality, but an awakening to something that gets lost in the reality once it's constituted and made ontologically consistent. There is a real that emerges on the very verge, and holding on to it started serving as the red thread for both theory and artistic practices. It embodies the break between two worlds, and in that break, something comes up for a moment that doesn't belong to either, and which only flickers. And it takes a supreme alertness and mastery to hold on to it, to prolong it, to make a literature out of it, to turn it into an object of theoretical pursuit. And I can list here somewhat schematically, in a very sort of simplified manner, a number of names and a single date. The date is 1913. In 1913, Kafka was writing The Trial. Proust published Swan's Way, the first volume of In Search of Lost Time. In 1913, Marcel Duchamp made his first ready-made, La Roue de Bicyclette. Kazimir Malevich painted the first version of the black square on the white background. Kandinsky and Klee were painting the first abstract paintings. In March 1913, Arnold Schoenberg organized a concert of his music and the music of his pupils in Vienna. The concert, which was violently interrupted, there was a huge scandal and questions were asked in the Austrian parliament. In May 1913, there was the first performance of Stravinsky's Le Sacre du Printemps in Paris, which was again interrupted, followed by a scandal and riots in the streets. In 1913, Freud is preoccupied with the metapsychological writing, some of his most perspicacious texts. This is indeed a year to remember. This is the year of awakening, if there ever was one. So what happened in the space of this 1 year? And of course, the means and the methods in these diverse instances are very different. The means and the methods have to tackle in various ways the key problems of how to make it endure, how to give a consistency and duration to something so fickle and completely elusive, how to hold on to something utterly vanishing. So my proposal would be that one could find in all these endeavors a common denominator of the edge that conditions this curious logic of waking up, an ontological opening not merely of the division of wakefulness and sleep, but of an unplaceable object, which opens the very divisions, the divisions inside-outside, the divisions time-space, the division of subject and other, and cannot be placed in them. So the advent of psychoanalysis pertains to this moment. So if there is a wake-up call pertaining to modernity, then this is a very peculiar kind of wake-up call, unlike anything that usually goes with this notion. Wake-up calls, to make it quick, constitute the very core of mechanisms of ideology. There is always a wake-up call involved in the basic ideological move, in what Althusser pinpointed by the notion of interpellation is precisely this: awakening to a recognition, an emergence of sense, the retroactive imposition of sense on what didn't make sense, from blindness to insight. So precisely when they call upon you to wake up, this is a moment of this lulling edge of going to sleep, actually, continuing to sleep. So this wake-up call, which I'm speaking about, is like the inverse of interpellation, a moment where sense and recognition falter, an experience that is impossible to sustain, yet which, once come to the foreground, casts a different light on everything, and the very notion of interpellation as a handy common denominator of this waking up could be conceived only on the basis of its impossibility. So in very different ways, this strange modality of waking up has shaped the subsequent theoretical and artistic pursuits, in persistent attempts to show fidelity to what emerges between two dreams, something that has no firm being. There is no simple way to hold on to it, and we still need the formidable guidance of Kafka and Freud. Thank you.